15 years ago, during one of those lazy summer holidays, my best friend Sarah and I found ourselves battling the familiar grip of boredom. New Braunfels, our small Texas town, was a quiet place, its streets stretched out and sprinkled with parks, fields, and endless night skies. That night, around midnight, we decided to head to the local park, a sprawling space of winding paths, tall oaks, and an eerie stillness after dark. At first, it was uneventful. We sat on the swings, talked about life, and let the warm breeze brush past us. An hour went by, maybe more. Nothing unusual. But then we saw it. In the dim light of the park's solitary lamppost, we noticed a figure crouched on top of a picnic table. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, but Sarah saw it too. Someone or something was there. It wasn't just odd that someone else was in the park at that hour. It was the way this thing perched, not sitting, not lying down, crouched like an animal ready to pounce. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was just some weirdo trying to scare us. But as I squinted, trying to make sense of the figure, my heart sank. My pulse quickened. Wings. There were wings. Not like a bird's, but tattered, leathery things that jutted out from the back of what otherwise looked like a human figure. My stomach churned, my body frozen as the world around me faded into silence. And then it screamed. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't animal either. It was something else, entirely. It tore through the night. A blood-curdling shriek that felt like it clawed at my very soul. It was high-pitched, guttural, and warped, like the screams of a dying woman twisted into something unnatural. Before I could react, the figure stood, 8 feet tall, at least. Its wings spread slightly, casting a shadow far larger than any human should have. And in that moment, every instinct screamed the same thing: run! We bolted. I ran until my lungs burned, until I could feel the rawness in my throat, until my legs threatened to give out. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still behind us, watching, waiting. We pounded on doors, begging for help, only to be met with threats and warnings. "I've got a gun! Get out of here!" neighbors yelled, their porch lights flickering on for brief moments before plunging us back into the darkness. For what felt like an eternity, we were trapped outside, vulnerable. I couldn't stop looking at the sky, half expecting to see it swoop down, those wings carrying it closer. Sarah gripped my arm so tightly it hurt, but I didn't care. Every sound, every shadow became a potential threat. Finally, after what must have been 20 minutes, flashing lights cut through the darkness. The police had arrived. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment. The officers, one white, one Mexican, listened to our story with raised eyebrows and knowing smirks. They chalked it up to kids being kids, maybe imagining. But when I glanced at the Mexican officer, something about his expression shifted. He pretended to laugh it off, but his face betrayed him. His eyes darted nervously. He avoided our gaze. He knew something. "Go home," he said gruffly, but his voice faltered just enough to send chills down my spine. The cops drove Sarah home, but I chose to walk the last few blocks alone. The night had never felt so long, the air so heavy. Every step I took, I felt eyes on. Every creak of a branch sent my heart racing. To this day, I can't go near parks or woods at night. The memory lingers, seared into my mind like a brand. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that scream. Because it wasn't just some person, some prank, or some coincidence. It was something worse, something out there. And it's still out there. When I was about 11 or 12, just a 6th grader navigating the world, I had a best friend. Let's call her A. We were inseparable, practically joined at the hip, and sleepovers at her house were a regular thing. But A's house wasn't like most houses. It was big, old, and had a strange energy about it that I could never quite shake. A love telling me about the spirits she'd seen there. Her stories were vivid, matter-of-fact, like it was just another Tuesday. She talked about a woman with brown hair packing up boxes, the ghost of her dead dog padding through the hallways, and even the heavy footsteps of her late grandfather. But the one that always made me uneasy was the sound of small, childlike footsteps echoing through the house. Footsteps with no child to make. I didn't believe in ghosts back then. My 6th grade logic brushed it all off. It's just the old AC, I told myself whenever I heard those faint footsteps. But A always insisted, her voice unwavering. It's not the AC, it's them. One Friday night, A invited me over for another sleepover. We spent hours in her room doing each other's hair and makeup, giggling about school drama and blasting music. By the time we decided to call it a night, it was around 1 a.m. We washed up, climbed into bed, and put on an episode of Pretty Little Liars. I don't even remember when I fell asleep, but I remember when I woke up. It was 3:30 a.m. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes your heartbeat seem loud. I'd woken up with an urgent need to use the bathroom, but as I opened my eyes, something stopped me cold. At the foot of A's bed, looming in the darkness, a figure. It wasn't just tall, it was massive, 10 feet at least. Its form was nothing but pure black, darker than the shadows that surrounded it, as if it absorbed any light that dared to touch it. It didn't move. It just stood there, impossibly still, towering over us. My chest tightened, my breath caught in my throat. My brain screamed at me to do something, to wake A, to scream, to run. But my body wouldn't listen, and then I heard it, breathing, slow, heavy, deliberate breaths. I could feel its eyes on me, though it had none that I could see. It knew I was awake. Somehow, I could feel it watching me, waiting. I told myself not to move, not to make a sound. The bathroom could wait. Everything could wait. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to fall asleep, but the sound of its breathing and the weight of its gaze pinned me to the bed like a stone. At some point, exhaustion must have taken over because when I opened my eyes again, sunlight was streaming through the windows. The room felt lighter, safer. The events of the night before felt almost like a dream. Almost. Over breakfast, I worked up the courage to ask A about it. So, what other spooky stuff goes on here? I tried to keep my tone light, casual, like it was just idle curiosity, a thought for a moment before shrugging. Not much else, really. Oh, wait. Sometimes I see this big dark shadow near my bed. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I never told A what I saw that night, and I never saw the shadow again. But every sleepover after that, I'd lie awake at night, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see it standing there again, waiting, watching. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a shadow. It wasn't just my imagination, it was something real, and it saw me. When I was about 11 or 12, I had a best friend. Let's call her A. A and I were inseparable, spending almost every weekend at each other's houses. But her house? It wasn't like any house I'd ever been in. It was huge, old, and had a presence. The kind of place that creaks even when no one's moving, where shadows linger just a bit too long. A had grown up there and was used to its strange energy. She even claimed the house was haunted. At first, I thought she was just trying to freak me out, but the way she spoke, calm, matter-of-fact, made it hard to dismiss. She'd tell me stories about a woman with brown hair she'd seen packing up boxes, the soft padding of her dead dog's paws in the hallways, and the unmistakable sound of her late grandfather's footsteps pacing near the kitchen. Then, there were the footsteps of a little girl, echoing through the house in the dead of night. Whenever I heard them, I'd tell myself it was just the old house settling. "It's the AC," I'd whisper to myself, clinging to logic. I would just smile knowingly. "It's not the AC," she'd say. One night, A invited me over for another sleepover. It was routine at this point. Snacks, gossip, doing each other's hair, and watching TV until we passed out. That night, we stayed up until 1 a.m., laughing and experimenting with makeup. By the time we crawled into bed and put on Pretty Little Liars, the exhaustion had set in and I drifted off, until I woke up. It was 3:30 a.m., and the room was suffocatingly quiet. That kind of heavy silence where you can hear the blood rushing in your ears. I'd woken up needing to use the bathroom, but as I shifted to get up, something stopped me. At the foot of A's bed, standing in the pale glow of the nightlight, was a figure. It was tall. No, massive. Its head almost brushed the ceiling. The figure was nothing but a pitch-black shadow, darker than the night around it. Its edges were blurred, like smoke, but its presence was sharp, undeniable. My heart pounded in my chest. My body froze. I tried to tell myself I was dreaming, that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it moved, just slightly, enough for me to hear the faintest sound of breathing, slow, deep, heavy breaths. I clamped my eyes shut, pretending to sleep. Maybe if I didn't move, it would leave me alone, but even with my eyes closed, I could feel it. That awful, bone-chilling feeling of being watched. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. My bladder ached, but there was no way I was moving. I stayed like that until the faint light of dawn began to seep through the curtain. When I finally opened my eyes, it was gone. I didn't say anything at first. Maybe it was a nightmare. Maybe I'd imagined it. But as we sat at the breakfast table later that morning, I couldn't help myself. "So, what other spooky stuff happens around here?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Grinned. "I've already told you most of it," she said, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, sometimes I see this big, dark shadow near my bed." My stomach dropped. I never told A what I saw that, but every time I slept over after that, I couldn't help but stare into the dark corners of her room, half expecting to see it again. I never did, but I know what I saw, and I know it saw me too. I live in a town where everyone sleeps before 10 p.m., not just out of habit, it's an unspoken law. As the clock strikes 10, doors are locked, lights extinguished, and silence takes over. Even the stray dogs disappear, leaving the streets hauntingly still. As a kid, I was curious. Why does everyone sleep so early? I'd ask my parents. They'd always give me the same vague answer. That's just the way it's always been. But that answer never sat right with me. What could be so important about sleeping by 10 p.m.? The older I got, the more I noticed the strange rituals of our town. No one stirred during the night, not for a glass of water, not for a crying baby, not even during storms. It was as if the entire town fell into a death-like slumber. Once, I overheard my parents whispering late at night. "He broke the rule," my father said. My mother's voice was shaky. Never woke up again. When they saw me standing there, their faces went pale, and they sent me back to bed. But their words stayed with me, echoing in my mind. What happened to those who stayed awake past 10 p.m.? One night, I decided to find out. The day started like any other. Dinner at 7, TV until 9, then off to bed. I pretended to sleep, listening as the house fell silent. At exactly 10 p.m., the quiet settled in, an oppressive, almost tangible stillness. I waited, my heart pounding, until I couldn't take it anymore. Slowly, I opened my eyes and sat up. The room felt colder than usual, the air heavy with an unexplainable tension. I crept to my bedroom door, easing it open. The hallway stretched before me, dark and silent. I tiptoed to my parents' room and peeked inside. They were fast asleep, their breathing steady. Satisfied they wouldn't wake, I turned back toward my room. That's when I felt it. The air shifted, growing heavier. My skin prickled with a sense of being watched. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Then a voice, low and cold, yet dripping with fury. "Why are you awake?" I spun around, expecting to see my mother, but her door was still ajar, and I could see her and my father lying in bed, motionless, asleep. The voice came again, louder this time, reverberating through the stillness. "You were supposed to be asleep." A figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the hallway. It was impossibly tall. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its body was gaunt, and its skin clung to its bones like wax melted over a frame. But the worst part, its face, or lack of one. Where features should have been, there was only a void, a swirling, endless blackness. "It's all your fault." Its voice a guttural snarl. "You should have stayed asleep." Panic gripped me and I ran. My legs felt heavy, my movements sluggish, but fear drove me forward. I slammed my bedroom door shut and pressed my back against it, trembling. The knocking started immediately. It wasn't just knocking, it was pounding, loud, violent, shaking the door on its hinges. Each blow reverberated through my body, but I held the door closed with every ounce of strength I had. Then silence. For a long time I stood there, too afraid to move. When I finally summoned the courage to open the door, what I saw chilled me to my core. The world outside my room had changed. The walls of the house were warped, their colors dull and muted. The air was thick, suffocating, and the clock on the wall caught my eye. Its hands weren't moving. It was 10 p.m., and it always would be. I wandered through the house, calling for my parents, but there was no one. The town outside was empty, its streets devoid of life. Days turned into weeks, or maybe months, I couldn't tell. Time no longer existed. I didn't eat, didn't sleep, yet I never grew hungry or tired. My body began to change. I grew taller, thinner. My skin stretched tight over my bones, and when I caught my reflection in a shattered window, I saw the truth. My face was gone. In its place was a void, just like the figure I'd seen that night. I don't feel human anymore. My memories of life before are fading, replaced by a deep, unrelenting anger. One night, as I wandered the empty streets, I saw something. A boy. He was small, trembling as he crept through his house. I watched as he tiptoed down the hallway, peeking into his parents' room. Rage boiled with, "Why are you awake?" The boy froze, his wide eyes locking onto mine. And in that moment, I understood. I wasn't watching it. I was watching myself. I stayed awake. And now, I am the one who ensures no one else ever. I used to live in this old, eerie house between the ages of 7 and 10. It's been years since, but the memories still linger, as vivid as the fear I felt back then. There was something off about that house, a constant sense of unease, like a pair of unseen eyes was always watching you. The strangest part of the house, though, was a small closet underneath the stairs, leading down to the basement. My sisters and I slept in the basement, but none of us ever dared to open that closet door. Even as a kid, I could feel something was wrong with it. At first, the creepy stuff was small. Lights that should have been off were suddenly on. Doors that were shut creaked open by themselves. My mom would brush it off as drafts or electrical issues, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. Then, things got worse. Most nights, I'd lie in bed feeling like someone or something was watching me from the darkness. It wasn't the normal kind of fear a kid might feel when it's dark. This was heavier, like the air was pressing down on me, daring me to move. Sometimes I couldn't move at all. I'll never forget one night in particular. I was about 8 years old and couldn't sleep. My room felt suffocating, so I decided to crawl into my mom's bed for comfort. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the unease creeping over me. Around 2 a.m., that feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. My body froze and I couldn't even scream. That's when I heard it. My mom's old music box, the one she kept on her dresser, started playing on its own. The haunting melody sent chills down my spine. I turned to wake my mom, but as soon as I reached for her, the music stopped. Just like that. I didn't sleep a second then. After that, things got worse for all of us. My sisters and I started refusing to sleep in our basement room. We'd huddle together on the couch upstairs, too scared to go back down. My mom thought we were just being kids, afraid of the dark, but the fear was real, the kind you can't just brush away. Eventually, my mom had to sell the house. We couldn't afford it anymore, but honestly, I think she was relieved to leave. On our last night there, my sister and I decided to do something we'd been too scared to do for years. We were going to open that closet on the stairs. We wanted to see what was inside, to prove to ourselves there was nothing to be afraid of. Armed with a flashlight, we crept down to the basement. The house was quiet, and the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and makes you hear your own heartbeat. We reached the closet. The door was slightly ajar, as if it had been waiting for us. My sister and I looked at each other, mustered up every ounce of courage we had, and stepped inside. The closet was small and cramped, with a faint smell of mildew. We shone the flashlight into the far corner, where the space turned into an L shape. As we moved closer to peer around the corner, bam! The closet door slammed shut behind us. We screamed, our voices echoing in the tiny space. Panic overtook us as we pushed and clawed at the door, trying to get out. My sister shoved me aside in her desperation, and I nearly fell over. When we finally burst out of the closet, we ran upstairs, our hearts pounding, and told my mom what had happened. She didn't believe us, of course. No one did. Years later, I learned the truth about that house. The man who had built it had lived there until his death. He died in the very room my sisters and I had slept in for years. Looking back, I wonder if it was him. The unseen presence that watched us at night. The one that froze me in place, that slammed the closet door shut. I still don't know what was behind that corner in the closet. And honestly, I'm not sure I ever want to find out. For decades, the small, quiet town of Oakland has been haunted by tales of a strange and terrifying creature. Witnesses describe it as a monkey-like beast standing around 4 feet tall, but weighing nearly 300 pounds. Its body resembles a gorilla's, with powerful limbs and a hunched posture, but its ears are unnervingly pointed, more like those of a bat or a cat. The creature's patchy, mangy fur only adds to its grotesque appearance. The first recorded sighting dates back to 1983. It was a cold evening, just past 8 p.m., and the manager of a local diner was closing up for them. As he locked the doors and began shutting off the lights, a loud bang echoed from the front window. Startled, he turned to see what caused the noise. Standing there, pressed against the glass, was the creature. Its thick body cast a looming shadow under the fluorescent streetlights, and its clawed hands left smudged prints on the window. The manager, terrified, called the police. When officers arrived, they fired their guns into the air to scare the beast off. The creature fled into the nearby woods, disappearing into the darkness. For years after that, Oakland was silent. The creature became little more than a town legend, something to frighten kids and fuel campfires, until 1991. The morning of December 16, 1991, started like any other, but by 7:30 a.m., the Oakland Police Department received a frantic call that changed everything. Sheriff Mike Doyle was the first to respond. He later described this. "I got a call from a frightened woman early that Monday morning. She was panicked, saying there was some kind of monkey out here attacking. I thought it was just another prank call, kids messing around. But when I got there, I saw the truth, and it's something I'll never forget. When the sheriff arrived, he found the woman locked inside her car, visibly shaking. She pointed toward the road, her trembling hand unable to steady itself. That's when he saw it. A body lay in the middle of the road. It was the remains of a 17-year-old boy, but calling it a body felt wrong. It was a mangled mess. His upper lip and nose had been torn clean off, leaving his face grotesquely exposed. His hands and feet were gone, ripped from his limbs in a frenzy of violence. Blood pooled around him, soaking into the asphalt. I couldn't believe my eyes, Sheriff Doyle recalled. It wasn't just an attack. It was a massacre. Whatever did this wasn't human. There was no sign of the creature when the sheriff arrived, but deep claw marks gouged into the surrounding trees told the story. Whatever had attacked the boy had vanished into the woods, leaving the town of Oakland in shock and horror. Since that day, sightings of the beast have been sporadic, but each encounter seems to echo the terror of those first incidents. The creature remains elusive, a ghostly figure lurking at the edges of the forest. Some locals swear it's nothing more than a wild animal, perhaps a mutated bear or a gorilla that escaped from captivity. Others believe it's something far more sinister, something not of this world. Whatever it is, the Beast of Oakland has left its mark on this town, one that may never fade. I was around 5 or 6 years old when my family had to move to a different province. At the time, we didn't have a permanent place to stay, so we ended up living in a nearby shelter while searching for a home. The shelter was in an old building, abandoned for years, until someone decided to convert it into temporary housing. We learned it had once been part of some kind of institution, long before I was even born. That knowledge alone gave the place an eerie feeling. Our room was strange. It was small, about 8 by 9 feet, with a heavy metal door that clanged shut. Inside were 2 bunk beds with unstable metal frames and hard, thin mattresses. The floor was cold concrete, and there wasn't even a single window. It felt more like a cell than a room, but we didn't complain. It was temporary, and we were the only family staying on that floor. One night, I went to bed early because I was exhausted. My mom opened the heavy door, walked me inside, and waited while I climbed the ladder to the top bunk. She turned the light off after saying goodnight, leaving me to the silence and the shadows. As I lay there, unable to sleep, I stared at the ceiling. Time dragged on, and then I heard it, the sound of the other bunk bed creaking, as though someone was climbing its ladder. I assumed it was my older brother, Aiden. He must have snuck into the room quietly to avoid waking. When I heard the creaking stop, I whispered, "Hey, Aiden, you didn't have to sneak in. I can't fall asleep anyway." There was no response. Thinking he hadn't heard me, I spoke a little louder. "Aiden, did you guys finish cooking yet?" Still nothing. I started to feel uneasy. Aiden never ignored me. He'd usually tease me or say something to help me fall asleep. Worried he might be upset, I sat up and turned to face the other bed. And then I saw her. Sitting cross-legged on the top bunk was a dark figure, a girl about my age. Her hair was tied in 2 braids, and she wore a puffy, old-fashioned dress. She was pointing directly at me, her head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I froze. I wanted to scream, but fear clamped down on my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. Instead, I yanked the blankets over my head and stayed there, trembling, until I eventually drifted into a restless sleep. Hours later, the sound of the door creaking open and light flooding the room startled me awake. My mom and siblings were back. The moment I saw them, I scrambled down the ladder and clung to my mom, shaking. She asked me what was wrong, but I didn't say a word. The next day, during our morning walk, I finally told her what I'd seen. I described the girl with the braids and the dress, how she had just sat there, silently staring at me. My mom's face paled as I spoke. To see if there was any truth to my story, she discreetly asked others at the shelter about a possible ghost. She gave no details, just a vague description. One woman, Courtney, replied without hesitation, "Yes, there's a spirit roam. She takes the form of a little girl with 2 braids and an old-fashioned dress. She used to visit me every night, but she stopped when your family moved in." My mom was horrified. From that day on, strange things started happening. I'd occasionally see a shadow darting out of the corner of my eye. At night, we'd hear the sound of knives sharpening in the kitchen when no one was there. Sometimes distant screams echoed from the basement, even when it was supposed to be empty. One day, our family booked the basement's family room, which was used for gatherings. It had a few toys, maps on the walls, wooden floors, and a TV. While watching The Land Before Time, I glanced toward the darker side of the room and saw her again. She stood there in the shadows, staring at me. Then she ran around the corner, disappearing into the other half of the basement. This time, I wasn't as scared. I thought she wanted to play. Without saying a word, I got up and started following her. "Where are you?" I called, wandering into the darkness. "Don't you want to play with me?" My mom, confused by my behavior, followed me. She was especially concerned because I'd always been afraid of the dark. She turned on the light, picked me up, and carried me back upstairs. Later, she asked why I'd gone into the dark part of the basement. "She wants to play," I replied simply. After that, things escalated. My mom and siblings began waking up with mysterious scratches and bruises. Within a week, my mom decided we had to leave. We left most of our belongings behind. Clothes, toys, everything. My mom was terrified the spirit might attach itself to our things and follow us. We only took essentials: food, IDs, and some money. We moved across town and started over, leaving the shelter and its haunting behind. But even now, I can still see her face. The girl with the braids, sitting silently, pointing at me from across the room. Back when I lived in my old house, strange things seemed to happen all the time. But this one moment still sticks with me. It was a regular school day, but I'd faked being sick to stay home. My mom worked from home, so it wasn't too hard to pull off. She spent her mornings on her computer talking to people who needed help quitting smoking. Her office was just down the hall from my room, so I could always hear her voice drifting through the house. That morning, I woke up around 9, feeling uneasy. It wasn't the usual groggy, just woke up feeling. It was different, like I was being watched. At first, I thought it was my mom quietly checking on me, but then I heard her voice coming from her room. She was mid-conversation with one of her clients. Confused, I yanked the covers off my head and looked around, but there was no one there. I sat there for a moment, convinced I wasn't alone. It wasn't like I saw anything, but the air felt heavy, charged, like something was in the room with me. Normally, I'd have ignored it and gone about my day, but this time, I felt oddly brave. I sat up in bed, refusing to let the fear get to me. Then, as I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, I heard it, breathing. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the mattress creaking or my feet brushing against the floor, but the sound didn't stop. It was steady, rhythmic, unmistakably the sound of someone breathing. I tried to reassure myself. Maybe it was just my mom, and I was hearing it through the walls. But then I caught her voice again, still talking to her client. The breathing didn't match hers. It overlapped, and it sounded so much closer. Panic started to creep in. I looked around the room, scanning every corner, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. No shadows, no movement, just me. And that sound, it got louder. The breathing wasn't coming from the corners of the room. It was coming from underneath my bed. I froze. For a moment, I thought about running out of the room, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I leaned over and began lifting the edge of my mattress. The breathing seemed to change. It slowed, like whoever or whatever was down. There was trying to be quieter. My heart was pounding as I looked under the bed, but there was nothing. No one. Just empty space, usual dust bunnies. Yet, the breathing didn't stop. It was louder than ever now, coming from directly below me. There were no vents under the bed, no appliances or anything that could have been making the noise, and the sound was far too organic to be mechanical. I didn't know what else to do, so I let the mattress fall back into place and decided to leave. Without looking back, I headed downstairs and turned on the TV. I remember sitting on the couch, watching Scooby-Doo, trying to drown out the memory of what had just happened. I never told anyone about it. I'm not sure why. I just didn't. Maybe I was afraid of what they'd think, or maybe I was worried talking about it would make it real. After that day, the breathing never returned, but I still wonder, whatever it was, why did it stop? I beg you, please stop. We've been here for so long, haven't we? I don't want to do this anymore. Please, I beg you, let me go. What have you gained after all these years? Does anything even have value now? I feel like I'm withering away. There's so little of me left. Can't you see? Nothing is there. There's no laughter, no joy, no sorrow, no pain in you or me anymore. Can't you realize our friends, our world, are different now? I want to leave. I want this to end. I just want to fade away in peace. If you're afraid, why don't we leave together? We'll finally have some peace then, won't we? Please, I don't think I can hold on much longer. Please. Peter's voice trembled as he recounted the strange monologue he'd been hearing for months. He sat stiffly in the chair across from the doctor, his hands gripping the edges as if letting go might send him spiraling into some abyss. It doesn't matter whether I'm awake or asleep, he continued. The same words keep looping in my head. I'm terrified, doctor. The doctor, an older man with graying hair and a warm demeanor, listened with a calm, practiced expression. His office was meticulously organized, every detail radiating professionalism and trustworthiness. Peter, the doctor said after a pause, his voice steady and soothing, there's no need to worry. This isn't anything serious. Relief washed over Peter, and his grip on the chair eased. He'd been dreading the possibility that something was fundamentally wrong with him. I just want to understand, Peter said, his voice cracking. What's causing them? The doctor folded his hands. You see, Peter, our minds are incredibly complex, but fragile. They weren't designed to be immortal. Sometimes our subconscious reacts to this, yearning for the imperfect, fleeting nature of what we once were. The voices you've been hearing, that's simply your subconscious resisting. It wants you to regress, to let go and wither as we were meant to. But there's no need. It's entirely curable, and I can ensure that you'll never be bothered by them. Peter exhaled deeply, a smile breaking the tension on his face. The reassurance was like a lifeline. Thank you, doctor. I just want to feel normal. The doctor nodded and gestured toward the door. Follow the nurse, Pete. She'll take care of you. The nurse, a calm and composed young woman, led Peter to a quiet room with a single bed. The space felt oddly sterile, but her presence was oddly comforting. Lie down, she instructed, handing Peter a small blue pill. Swallow this. Peter obeyed, then watched as she prepared a syringe filled with a clear blue liquid. She injected it into his arm, the cool sensation spreading quickly through his body. As she left the room, Peter felt his eyelids grow heavy. The world around him blurred as sleep claimed him. Just before his consciousness faded completely, a voice echoed from within him. Thank you for letting me go. Goodbye. When Peter woke 4 hours later, the room was quiet. He felt different, lighter almost, but also hollow. It was as though he'd lost something precious, though he couldn't recall what it was. Still, the voices were gone. Smiling, he thanked the doctor profusely, paid him extra for his efforts, and left the office. Once Peter was gone, the doctor returned to his desk, flipping open his logbook. His pen moved across the page with practiced precision. I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I slept on the top bunk of a pretty tall bunk bed with my brother. We always kept the door open when we went to sleep, just in case something happened, so our parents could hear us. I guess that came in handy this time. For some reason, I always woke up in the middle of the night during the pitch black hours, when everything felt extra still. On this particular night when I woke up, something didn't feel right, and unfortunately, I made the worst mistake of my life. I looked out from under the covers. To clarify, I was sleeping on the top bunk, which was about 7 feet off the ground. When I looked out, I saw a man standing, but something was very wrong. He was glowing an eerie green and looked kind of blurry, as though he was partially out of focus. His clothes were from the Victorian era, old-fashioned and strange, and the worst part? He was either floating or was at least 10 feet tall, standing there in my room. His eyes seemed to pierce straight into my soul. I couldn't handle it. I screamed so loudly that it woke my parents and my brother. By the time my parents rushed in, the man faded away right before my eyes. It was like he disappeared into thin air. They told me it was just a nightmare and to go back to sleep, but I know what I saw. To this day, I still wake up in the middle of the night when it's pitch black. Now, I just try to go back to sleep without looking around. I never open my eyes when I wake up, not after that night. I live in a small town called Middle Vale. It's not the nicest place, kind of a dump really, but it's quiet, tucked away in the mountains, and affordable. Most people live here because it's cheap, and then they commute to the big city nearby for work. The main highway exit to the city is a few miles north of Middle Vale, on a road that leads up to the next biggest town, Westchester. Right near the highway exit, there's a local Walmart. One early morning, I was on my way to work and stopped by that Walmart to pick up a box of donuts to share with the office later. The parking lot is rarely more than 20% full because Middle Vale is small and Westchester has its own Walmart. That morning, there were only 2 pickup trucks in the lot as I pulled up in my little car. I have this habit of parking far from the building, even when the lot is practically empty. Maybe I just like walking. So I pulled into a space about 50 yards from the Walmart entrance. As I parked, I noticed a little person standing against the front wall of the building. It was still early, and the sun hadn't come up yet, so I couldn't make out much. I remember seeing her standing by the building. I looked down briefly to make sure my car was in park. When I looked up again, she was no longer there. Instead, she was standing right outside my passenger window. She was a short young woman with brown hair, and she was staring down at me. Through the glass, she said something I'm pretty sure was, "Can I get in your car?" My immediate instinct was to get out of the car and into the store where there were other people. I didn't know what this person wanted, but I didn't think it was good. "Can I help you, ma'am?" I asked, but I was already walking toward the building. "I need a ride to Westchester. Can I get in your car?" "I'm not headed that way," I replied. "Well, can you give me a ride to Middle Vale?" At that point, I had made it halfway to the store's entrance. She had followed me and was now standing halfway between the Walmart entrance and my car. "I'm not headed that way either, ma'am," I said, and walked inside. Now, I'm pretty good at picking up on social cues. If she seemed scared, like she was trying to escape from someone or needed help, I would have called the police. But I didn't get those vibes from her. She wasn't acting like someone in distress, like a drug addict or prostitute. She just really, really wanted to get into my car. I grabbed my donuts, paid for them, and walked back out. When I stepped outside, the parking lot was completely empty, except for my car and the 2 trucks. The sun had risen over the hills to the east. I had a ghost in the house just one night. At the time, I was living alone. I still do. Still in the same house. I was 35 and had been living in my home for about 2 or 3 years. Nothing unusual had happened in all that time. One night, I was reading in bed. It was an average-sized bedroom, and my bed faced the door. The door was open. I had no pets at the time, and no reason to close the bedroom door. I usually read before bed, so there I was, sitting up with the light on, reading. But I had this creeping feeling like I was being watched. I couldn't shake it. I'd be reading, trying to immerse myself in the story, but I couldn't get past the sensation. I kept looking up. I'd peer into the main area of the house. All dark, all lights off. Nothing. No noise, no light. I had locked the front and back doors just like I did every night. I live in Minneapolis, so this wasn't some remote, isolated town. I just couldn't concentrate on my book. The feeling of being watched kept growing stronger. It was like watching TV with someone who's staring at you while you're watching the screen. You don't even need to turn to them. You can just feel their eyes on you. It wasn't a threatening feeling, not exactly. It was creepy, sure, but I didn't feel like I was in danger. I tried shaking it off, but I couldn't focus on my reading. So I turned off the light and tried to sleep, but that made the sensation worse. It didn't feel like the presence was in my room, though. It always seemed to be just beyond the bedroom door, in the dark of the rest of the house. After a few minutes of this intense feeling, I realized I wouldn't be able to fall asleep. I had to check. What if someone was hiding in the house? This was before cell phones, and I wasn't going to call someone, so I did something even more foolish. I got up. I turned on the lights in the dining room. Nobody there. I went back to bed laughing at myself for being ridiculous. Turned off the light. Immediately, the sensation came back, just as strong. I was being watched. I tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. I got up again. I turned on the lights. I grabbed my softball bat and walked the entire house. This was probably the bravest or the stupidest thing I'd ever done. I went into every room, turning on every light. I checked every closet, every nook and cranny. I went into the basement, looked behind the basement stairs, double-checked the front and back doors. Both were locked. All the windows were secure. My upstairs wasn't finished at the time. It was under renovation. But I went up there and checked every little space. A full hour had passed since I first noticed the feeling. If someone were hiding in my house and meant me harm, I doubt a chunky 35-year-old with an aluminum bat would have been much of a threat, so it was pretty dumb. But I felt confident I was alone in the house. This was just my mind playing tricks. The house was empty. I was 100% sure. I went back to my bedroom, turned off all the lights except the bedside lamp. I was still shaken, though, freaked out that I'd even walked through the house in the first place. Who does that? I laughed at myself and started reading again, but the feeling came back. It was stronger now. I was being watched. At this point, I started paying more attention. Did I feel in danger? Number. Did I feel an evil spirit? Not exactly. It wasn't that kind of feeling. It was just a presence. It wasn't trying to scare me, but it was definitely trying to make me aware that it was there. It was intentional, like it wanted to communicate something. I called out into the dark living room, "I don't want you here. Please go away." Nothing changed. I yelled other things like, "I don't know what you want," and even, "Go into the light," which I got from Poltergeist, the original one. Now, I realize how dumb that sounds, but I didn't know what else to do. I didn't really believe in ghosts, but I wasn't exactly sure I didn't either. I've had some weird things happen in my life, but nothing like this. It felt intentional. I was still being watched. Finally, I gave up. "Fine," I said, "no sleep tonight." I read my book as best I could, knowing there was no one in the house with me. I woke up in the morning with the bedroom light on and the book on my chest. The last time I looked at the clock, it was around 4 a.m. When I woke, I felt exhausted, like I hadn't slept at all. My eyes burned from the lack of sleep. The feeling of being watched was gone, though. The house felt normal again. I called in sick to work and slept until noon. That afternoon, I was cleaning out a filing cabinet, throwing away old papers and making room for new stuff, when my phone rang. I was sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers. A woman's voice said, "Is this Eddie, sir?" I confirmed. I didn't recognize her voice, but this was a long time ago, before telemarketing calls were a regular thing. She said, "I'm a friend of Richard Kaitz. I'm very sorry to tell you, he passed away yesterday afternoon after a long illness. You were one of the friends he wanted notified." Richard and I had been friends in college. He'd once expressed deep romantic feelings for me, but I didn't feel the same way. We stayed friends, but we drifted apart. His flashy clubbing lifestyle and my quieter love for gardening and books just didn't mix. No drama, just one of those friendships that fade. But he was a good guy, and we had years of a solid friendship. I hadn't been in touch with him. I moved to Minneapolis. I was a little surprised that I was on his call list. When she said Richard had passed, I just knew. I knew it had been him the night before. I knew it right away. The sensation of being watched, not dangerous but present, made sense now. It wasn't malicious. It was just him, wanting to say goodbye. I've never felt anything like that in the house since then.